Much for coming in to talk to us about this. You know, this is an issue, I'm sure it's very high on your agenda, it's very high on ours, on the city, on the surrounding towns, and obviously it's getting a lot of attention. So this is a great timing for this conversation as well. We have you guys coming in today, the 5 of you, and then I believe we have 4 or 5 on Thursday as well. We were sort of hoping we'd get you in one room at one time, and that would be interesting, but I know schedules being the way they are, that we're doing it in 2 sessions. We don't have, other than the topic, and clearly what we all know that something needs to happen and we want to talk, but we don't have like a very specific agenda for you. We really want to know what you guys are thinking about, what can happen, how to get it done, timing of it, and where you are as we move forward. So that's sort of the brief intro. We're just hoping for a dialogue with you, and then I think Brian's going to give you some specifics about how we go about doing this.
All right. So welcome back. When I first came to the Standard Times 20 years ago, we did these legislative delegation meetings all the time, and I think it's a great tradition, and this is a great topic to start off with. So just if you remember, those of you who've been around, the editorial board meetings are on the record, and we tape them, and we're also videotaping today. It's a digital era, and we find that our readers appreciate that, and so that's the way we'll do it. The Standard Times tradition is to, even though we all know each other, to introduce ourselves so that people who are listening can identify as to who's talking. So I'm going to start the recording now. So welcome to the Standard Times Editorial Board. We're here to discuss the upcoming legislative session and ideas that the legislature and the governor might have for reforming the state's funding system. We made some progress in that last year, and with the growth of charter schools and other issues in terms of health care, special education costs, and English language learner cost, there is a feeling that funding formula needs to be revisited. So we're here to learn what you guys have to say. We're happy to have a bipartisan group. And so I'm Jack Spillane, the editorial page editor. We're gonna.
It's me.
That's why we keep you.
Shane Trimble, I'm a citizen member of the editorial board and also the director of transit planning for SRTA.
Beth Purdue, editor of the Standard Times.
Mark Montigny, I represent New Bedford, Fairhaven, Dartmouth, Mattapoisett, and Acushnet in the Senate.
Chris Markey, I represent Dartmouth and a little piece of New Bedford, Wards 3.
Good morning, I'm Senator Michael Rodrigues. I represent 7 communities in the South Coast: Westport, Fall River, Somerset, Swansea, Freetown, Lakeville, and Rochester. In this prior session, I served as the Senate Majority Whip and the Senate Chair of the Committee on Ethics.
Good morning, Susan Williams Gifford, and I am State Representative from Wareham, for Wareham, Carver, and Middleborough.
And I'm Bill Straus from Mattapoisett, State Representative. I represent the towns of Marion, Mattapoisett, Rochester, Fairhaven, and also a piece of New Bedford.
Okay, so we'll leave it open to whoever wants to start first. We're here to hear what you have to say, and one of the important things for us to know about this session and this effort to look at the funding formula.
We didn't want to pick one of you to go first because we thought then we'd have to go one by one by one. So I realized that opening is a little harder, but
I nominate the dean of the delegation.
I was thinking I should be excused because of a conflict of interest. Shane is my mother's neighbor and she loves him, so I think you should be allowed to question me.
Well, she sold the house, though.
That's unbelievable. After 60 years, very difficult, actually, very sad. But she's healthy, that's what's happening.
So resolve the conflict.
So we know this topic is really getting a lot of attention right now. We know that you as legislators looked at this last session. We know that there are some disagreements about what happens. Can we say across the board, though, does everyone agree that something needs to change?
Absolutely.
I'll start and say that since the Foundation Budget Review Commission has completed its work back in 2015, and I'll only speak from us in the Senate, we have been very committed in trying to implement some of those recommendations of the Foundation Budget Review Commission, looking at really 4 areas that are the real cost drivers in K through 12 education. Healthcare costs, English language learners, low-income students and how you measure low-income students. And the 4th one, which escapes me, special education. We have, over the years, addressed many of those issues independently, but not to the degree that has relieved our local communities on real pressure points in those 4 areas. We certainly heard from Senate President Spilker in her address when we were sworn in last week that she wants to be quote-unquote bold, and this along with transportation and healthcare, education funding along with transportation and healthcare, are issues that she wants to tackle in a comprehensive way this legislative session. We heard from Governor Baker that he wants to address the education funding issue also in a very comprehensive way, to the point where he just yesterday stated that he's going to file a standalone bill just on this issue, so that it doesn't get mired in the budget debate, which certainly will be discussed as we debate the FY20 general operating budget. You know, but the devil's always in the details, and there's lots of details, and you know, how much money can we afford to spend on it? Where does the money come from?
Yeah.
Do we do out of existing revenues? Do we create new revenues? How do you deal with the conflict between urban and suburban schools? Very, very controversial. And I'm confident, you know, we haven't yet heard from the speaker, but I'm sure we will soon when he does his address to the Commonwealth. And I'm assuming this will be at top of his agenda also.
Is that scheduled?
Just welcome Peter Muse, who's another member of our citizen advisory.
Hi, I'm Mike Rodrigues.
I know.
Yeah, how you doing,
Susan
Peter?
Gifford.
Yes, thank you very much.
Peter's with
Nice to see the
Just
team.
don't go to the bank looking like that.
No, I know.
Yeah.
It's a bit
You're on video already.
Thank you
Keeps
guys
it going,
for
thanks.
always allowing me
Yeah.
to come. I appreciate it.
So the
Yeah.
House, I'm sorry, the Speaker hasn't scheduled his speech, but there are a few very obvious things. And it's all, I think it's all good, positive things. I remember when Mark and I joined the legislature, there was a almost identical setting when we were first sworn in, where at the end of the prior legislature, they had come very close on an ed reform piece, and just inches away, so to speak. And there was a very clear public consensus for the legislature, at that time a little less so with the then governor, but that ed reform needed to be addressed, and almost all of the same issues were pending then.
Can I ask what year you're in?
Somehow I forgot to mention. Mark, when was it?
1993.
Okay.
1993.
Okay.
And
Great
and-
excuse for term limits.
And when we came in, the climate was so clear that we had to, in the new legislature, had to deal with it. That at that time, both the House and Senate devoted time in January, right away at the beginning of the session, to deal standalone with ed reform, both as to funding and organizational structure, which is less, I think, on anyone's agenda now, because I think some of those things in terms of the relationship of school committees, superintendents, management issues, really has worked quite well, I think. So we're back to the funding side, which obviously population shift, growth in certain communities that was occurring then is not occurring, and vice versa. So where we are, and the reason I dwell on what we did successfully then was in the bill that became law, and I think this was the missing piece that separated the House and Senate last summer, but will be filled, I think everyone's optimistic, was that the final piece of legislation, which not everyone voted for, but we did, Senator and I, and everyone else from around here, as I recall, was we not only said there's a target for how much added state revenue comes into the Chapter 70 funding for our public schools, but we will lay out in the legislation the schedule. What I think separated, not by anyone's bad intentions, but I think that what separated the House and Senate last summer was we didn't have the schedule yet. So if you pick a number, whether it's $1 billion more in Chapter 70 or $1.5 billion, whatever the number, when we did this in the 90s, we said we will add 200 and we'll add 200 more on top of that the next year, and we had a set schedule over 5 years to the point where we were spending $1 billion more to assist local school districts. So everyone has the same goal, which ultimately is that whether we make it there or not, that the quality of the education that the children receive, K through 12, should be as top-notch, regardless of what school system they're in. It's an enviable target, but it's a good target even if we fall short. What was missing last year, we didn't have that schedule. How are we going to get there at what pace? And the legislation that was in conference between the two chambers set up a process, but not a number, where it promised that each year Ways and Means and the commissioner and all the rest would get together and pick a number. The feeling in the House was we should do the complete package. Let's set the full schedule so everyone knows, both from an honesty standpoint, how quickly are we going to get there, but also then to allow us to answer the tough questions about where's the money going to come from. It's not enough, obviously, to say we're going to spend this much. It's got to be paid for. Right. So, but I think everyone's quite optimistic that this is one of the top 2, 3, 4 things that the legislature needs to address.
And optimistic about all 4 points?
Well, I'm only optimistic because what happened at the end of the last session was just a complete irresponsibility on behalf of the legislature. I mean, give me a break. It's like, it's optimistic because it's now bubbled up to the point where it needs to get done, and it should have been done yesterday. I don't think we need to study it more. I don't think we need to spend a whole lot of time talking about process. I think basically when people say it's not about the money, it usually is, although I don't think you can do, just as in '93, it wasn't done perfectly, but we didn't throw money at it without reform. Well, now a lot of the reform has been done. Things evolve. You look at best practices here and elsewhere, and you tweak things. But the bottom line is, for those that are distressed by the achievement gap, which means cities like New Bedford, it is about money. And all 4 of them should have been dealt with last year at the end of the conference. The 2 big ones, like English language learning and low income, are what is the most important to this city. There's another myth that is often repeated over and over and over, mainly by the leadership on Beacon Hill, but then it trickles down, and that is we don't have the money. We have the money now, we had it yesterday, we'll have it tomorrow, even if, as I predict, we'll come into tougher times. I'm a numbers guy. I study the economy every day. I studied it for 4 years. The best and worst learning experience one can have is 4 years of Ways and Means, and that included years with money and years with 9C cuts with revenue falling off a cliff. There's always money. There's not a willingness to cut and prioritize. So we give away billions and billions and billions of dollars in corporate tax cuts, some of which are useful, and maybe they ought to be looked at and analyzed and re-upped. Everything else ought to be sunsetted, and we ought to force each special interest, and I say that with big quotes, and their block and tacklers in the legislature, which means folks that are cozy with lobbyists that come in and do things like defend a film tax credit that's not defensible, or defend $1 billion to the biotech industry, when the leaders of that industry must just smirk. They must watch the politicians walk outside the room and go, there they go, let's just do a ribbon cutting with them in 6 months and everything will be fine. It's a thriving industry that's here for a reason, and it isn't for the $1 billion that we've thrown away. So if you need to find money and you don't have the ability to raise revenue, and I'm not saying that you shouldn't discuss new forms of revenue, fine, discuss it. But I'm pretty progressive, and I voted against the sales tax increase because that was a regressive tax on people who couldn't afford it. And I voted against the transportation tax for the simple reason that for 10 years, I asked the Senate President at the time, it was Travellini and Murray, who were quite frankly very cozy with lobbyists, and we just said, have a discussion about what tax cuts actually induce behavior that results in the mission statement of that tax cut. When you said, we're going to incentivize the financial services industry so we can create and retain jobs. So 20 years later, the entire industry has changed. They employ less than half the people they promised to retain, and there's no clawback because the legislature is spending other people's money. So as much as I think a good discussion, and the millionaire's tax certainly would have been in some ways a relatively easy way to fund this, as much as I think that should be discussed, what we should be doing is looking at the billions and billions of dollars of corporate tax credits that come very well lobbied, so it's not without some pain, I guess, for some people, and throw that money back in the pot. It's easy to pay. I mean, the estimates are $700 million, $1 billion, $1.5 billion. It's peanuts compared to what we give away if we stop some of the corporate giveaways.
Reactions to that? Thoughts?
Well, I'll chime in. First thing I want to say is that what Bill said is absolutely correct, and as my minority party had a member on the conference committee that was trying very diligently to hammer out a deal at the last minute, and what Bill said is absolutely spot on with her assessment as to what was happening at the end. It's just there was a fundamental difference between the House philosophy and the Senate philosophy. But I do agree that I think we're all in agreement that this is a hot button issue for all of us. I don't believe that any of us, with the exception of my colleague here from Mattapoisett, that we don't represent wealthy communities.
I've been to Westport Harbor.
Oh,
it looks nice.
Nice summer community.
I had to give it. But no, I think the bill that
That's right here, that's right here.
Senator Chang Diaz filed, that was basically the catalyst for getting this moving, had widespread bipartisan support. There definitely is support from the minority party in moving this forward. I think that the big question is, where's the revenue going to come from? And I do think that we need to wait and see what's going to come forward. As was said, the governor's going to file a standalone bill on this. He had also made a commitment in his 2020 budget recommendations that he was going to include additional funding for some of those areas. Again, not a fix for everything that's wrong, but realizing that there are problems that we have to address before we may be able to get the overall big picture on the formula changes done. So I think we're all pretty much in agreement that something needs to be done. The formula, since I've been in office in 2003, this is something that I've been talking about for 16 years, so it's not something new. It's been out there. Everybody knows it's been a problem, but the problem has just been manifesting and festering, and with the influx of the English language learners that are coming in, out of district, special education, we're really being hard hit, especially in the South Coast area. And I know that as a delegation, I'm sure we're all going to be working together very diligently to try to get this done.
Is your inclination to do it without new revenue, or because of the Supreme Court decision, or to look at that too?
Well, I do have to say that I agree with what Mark had said about that we should be looking at the issue of the corporate tax credits and the film tax credits and sunset those and look at those on a recurring basis you know, not just give them an open-ended, you know, checkbook, so to speak, or, you know, an open-ended check. But, I mean, we need to look at everything. We need to look at the possibility of other revenue sources, although we have $2 billion sitting in our rainy day fund, which would certainly be, you know, some of that money would go a long way to implementing possibly like a phase one of the changes to the funding formula. So everything's on the table at this point, I'll have to say, and you know, you can't rule anything out.
I think we obviously need new revenues to get it. That's at the end of the day, we can say all these things about this, but unlike the film tax credit, we vote on it every year. On all the tax credit, anything tax related, anything revenue related, we vote on every year, and it gets renewed every year. I don't think a millionaire's tax is the way to go. I think we've just lowered the income tax. I think we need to increase the income tax and increase the earned income tax credit, so that that can be much like was proposed, I think, in the 2013 budget by Governor Patrick. At the end of the day, the millionaire's tax is so easy politically for all of us, right? I mean, you vote for it and then you put it in the Constitution. It allows no flexibility for the people who come next in line. You're putting a surcharge on people who make a lot of money, and somehow that's the answer, is just to keep taxing the rich. I think in the end, you have to look at it in a balanced approach. When you rely on such a small amount of people to produce that large of income, when the economy crashes, when the capital gains goes down, those revenues are going to go down dramatically. And when they go down dramatically, we're back here trying to justify why we're cutting everything else that we've just increased. We need to be responsible. We need to take a vote that says, hey, it's time for us to increase taxes a little bit. If you went up to 5.5%, you would have, you know, for a person making $100,000 a year, it's an extra $500 bucks. I think someone can live with that. If the idea is that we want to make sure, again, I don't believe that the millionaire's tax is appropriate for a variety of reasons. One, economically, it's horrible because of those ideas, at least in my mind. And secondly is, we're there to make sure that the money is spent appropriately. If we think more money should go to education, then we should put it there. If we think more should go towards transportation, we should put it there. It shouldn't be in the Constitution to tell us where to spend the money or not. We're elected officials, we're going to be accountable, and we will be.
So you guys have Democrats have a supermajority in the legislature. The governor was unlikely to sign any kind of income tax increase. Do you have the votes in that supermajority to override it?
I have no idea. You're asking me my opinion. I don't count votes. It's the first 2 weeks. We've been sworn in for 4 or 5 days now. I have no idea what. If you're looking for a quick result and say, hey, it's going to happen, I don't know. But if you're asking me what my opinion is I think a broad-based tax increase that's slight, that's not huge, is a better, safer way in the long term for the economy than a millionaire's tax, which politically is the easiest thing for all of us to do.
A lot of people agree with that.
I think both Rep. Markey and Senator Montigny both strike, and everyone strikes a theme that, you know, came here to talk about education funding, the Foundation Budget Review Commission, but the debate and the discussion always turns to money and revenue because it costs money. And the most difficult thing to do in the legislature or in public is to have an adult conversation about taxes. And we've attempted, prior to coming in to leadership, I did serve for 4 years as the chair of the Senate Revenue Committee, and we tried to do things like amend the film tax rate. I mean, do we think that it was a worthwhile investment for the Commonwealth to spend $89 million in FY17 for the film industry, where 74% of that money goes out of state, where we are paying, the taxpayers of Massachusetts are paying 25% of the salaries of all the Hollywood movie stars and starlets, because that's what's happening. But you know, we were unsuccessful to amend that. We also looked at areas of this new so-called 21st century disruptive economy, people call it, Airbnb, for instance, short-term rentals, that we did finally get over the goal line at the end of last session, and that's new revenue. I think it's grossly understated at $25 million. And it's grossly understated because there's really no real data, because so much of that activity happens in the underground economy. Just this week we're hearing about car sharing and the whole new 21st century disruptive economy of, you know, Airbnb for your automobiles, where you share your vehicles. So you need to look at a combination of looking at, and not many people do pay attention, Senator Montigny certainly does, on the tax expenditure budget. It's billions of dollars that with these, especially if they're refundable tax credits, it's just like a line item in the budget. You're writing a check in these tax credits. We need to look at that. We have begun implementing over the last 5 years that all tax credits are now sunsetted. So there's no, it does not go on into perpetuity until someone decides to take action to amend or rescind them, but they have to be looked at every 5 years for us to make a determination if we think it's still a responsible investment of tax dollars for the Commonwealth. So you need to look at a combination of possibly new revenue, whether it's income tax, millionaire's tax, whatever the new sort of tax is, or adjusting our tax codes so that it better reflects what our priorities are today.
So, Jack, you had asked a question as to whether in voting for focusing on education, whether that would be done, or it has to be done, linked with the revenue piece. Probably not in so explicit a trade. When we've done these things, and that's the importance of what I was trying to express earlier about knowing what our out-year commitments are for education. So what is the 5 or 6 year schedule of increases? And then it fits in with the overall budget, so that I don't think you need a specific education revenue piece in order to do this, but you have to do it within the rest of the pie and in any individual budget year. So now we begin discussions about fiscal year 2020, which begins July 1. So we approve a budget in the spring based on a revenue schedule, predicted revenue schedule that goes on for the next 14 or 15 months. And that's why you have mid-year corrections and things like that. But education, of course, doesn't just sit in the vacuum. We have the biggest single item of healthcare that we take care of in one way or another in the annual budget. And we're going to have to navigate that with obviously some uncertainty as to whether the federal government is still a partner or not. And then transportation, which not surprisingly, I hope coming from me, I have the feeling that we don't spend enough. Only last month in one of their asset management review documents that is now public but hasn't for some reason made it online, the administration has acknowledged that our current spending on roads and bridges over the next decade actually takes us backwards in terms of our state of good repair for our roads and bridges, forget mass transit. So even the administration has quietly acknowledged that we don't spend enough on transportation anymore just to stay level. So we'll do the education, but I think the public has to understand there are other critical things that are part of the $40 billion annual budget and separate capital budget. But to your question, does this get linked to a specific tax fee revenue item? I don't think so. I don't think that's how it would play out.
do they need to be addressed together? Because they're such big issues, healthcare, transportation, education.
I really believe the legislature has proved over the years that it's capable of keeping those things in mind as it does each of these pieces.
But the easy stuff is off the table. I agree with Chris that the easier of the options was the millionaire's tax, which, by the way, I gleefully support. I stress the word gleeful. But I get his points on it, and I also do believe it was an easier way to sweep at least a couple of those things off the table. Now that that's gone, or maybe it isn't, who knows what iteration will come back to address the constitutional issues. But you can't talk about education without talking about revenue, and you can't talk about revenue without admitting that there are no easy options. So the likelihood, I also don't count votes, but the one benefit I have as chairman of rules in the legislature is all of the members come to me on their bills, and you pick things up. What are their real priorities? What are they really looking for? What are the things that they are troubled by when a president utters a priority in a swearing in or over the last 3.5 years with the Karen Spilker's predecessor? I don't believe the votes are there for an increase in the income tax. Who knows? That's somebody else's role to count those votes. But again, I will personalize it. I'm a progressive, and I don't stand behind that. But after 4 years watching a budget and watching the waste, it's very difficult not to be fiscally conservative with other people's money. Now, I used to look at folks that said they were socially liberal and fiscally conservative as somewhat hypocritical. I don't think you need to be. I think everyone should be against what I saw in my first maintenance meetings when I looked at a budget with no rationale, and it was just, oh, well, we did that before. And I'll just mention one reason why I feel so strongly that there are revenues. 1 year sitting in these maintenance meetings, which sometimes would last until midnight and they'd be 12 hours long, and I said to my staff, like, you can't answer me, like, who earmarked this? Like, I know when I earmark this Italian theater, it's there for a reason. And I have to defend that, or at least prioritize it in a zero-sum game of my priorities. So we did a little trick. We wiped out all of the earmarks 1 year. Now, two things that happened from that. One, they had to come and ask the chairman of Ways and Means for something, which makes it easier for me to then line up their votes on the tough things. So it was a political exercise. But another magical thing happened. Half the earmarks went away and no one requested them. Multiply that by hundreds of millions of dollars of wasted money. Then I started to get into the tax cuts, and I come from that with a little different, I know we're here on ed reform, but if you're talking about $700 million to $1.5 billion, you have to talk about revenue. I came out of the Chamber of Commerce. I didn't come out of the liberal think tank. And I never had a business executive say to me, the only reason we located in X was because you gave us some peanuts. But if you give them to us, I have a fiduciary responsibility, thank you. Now remember, they were talking to me as their economic developer. So they're telling me the unvarnished truth of what makes decisions. And by the way, it's far less varnished when it comes to industries like the biotech industry, that it really is peanuts. So we had the Secretary of Economic Affairs before a committee I chaired at the time. I think it was at post-audit. And I simply asked a question. I wasn't setting him up, although by the redness of his face, I knew that it turned into be a set-up question. I simply asked him, can you quantify the number of jobs created by this program that you claim creates jobs? No, we'll get back to you. He's never gotten back to me. He's since left the building. So when you multiply that out by billions and billions of dollars, and you realize that it is very difficult to change that policy because of the power of the industry and the lobbyists, but then you look at how much more difficult it would be to raise general revenues, I think you have to keep coming back to something that is completely unjustifiable. And I say that because I think the achievement gap in this city and in similar cities and demographics across the state is a crisis. Of course, we don't really respond in a crisis way when something isn't acute. So when a gas explosion happens and people die, everyone responds to the crisis, starting with first responders and even politicians. When something slips, like an economy does, or something grows slowly, like an achievement gap or an income gap does, it's almost like a bear market or a recession. You never really know until you look back and look at all the stats and go, why didn't we see that? It's as plain as day. when you look at all of the demographics. You look at, if you are wealthy, you can send your kid to Tabor. You can even actually make a donation and get a tax credit and maybe get him or her in our legacy program. But then, if they're struggling, they don't have to take the MCAS. But we say to kids that are struggling, to survive, you're a failure in the public schools, even if you have no one at home helping you. I mean, let's like kind of strip the varnish off. I mean, you know, we have this myth that everybody's got equal education, particularly in Massachusetts. We're #1, right? I mean, there are states that are a lot more conservative with universal pre-K, and yet we say we don't have the money. The achievement gap is going to be expensive to fill. I'll end this part of the commentary with this. I mean, when Tip O'Neill said all politics is local, no, it's personal, and it is to a legislator too. So of course we represent our philosophy, we represent our constituency, we represent our experiences. So if we chaired judiciary, we have a lot more experience, and I'll call Chris actually, and he doesn't always like that I don't always agree with him, but I know I can get expertise from him that I don't have because I didn't sit there as a prosecutor. I have an expertise in numbers, and I look at it and say, we can do this, but not as long as, for instance, we say, like the way we sort of buy the vote of someone who represents a wealthy suburb is we say, oh, well, we'll give you a little bit of minimum aid. You know, a minimum aid is literally like, we kind of want your vote and don't want you to say anything, so we're going to throw Lincoln and Concord $50,000. And we're sitting here in this community worried about how we're going to get people through high school and into college and into the mainstream economy.
So you raise a lot of good points, and I sort of want to shift the conversation if we can, because we are going to run out of time, and I know you're all busy, but we've talked a lot about funding. But one of the things you're raising too is, I think Senator Rodrigues, you raised it right at the beginning, is this kind of competing interest of suburbs and cities, and where this is going to go for that.
It's happening in the city.
Yeah, that's true.
What do you mean?
Vocational school has more students than New Bedford High School. Okay? A vocational school is a vocational school where you learn a trade. When you have 90% of your vocational school graduates going on to college, yeah, it's great and it's a nice success story, but their success is coming at a significant, great cost to the high school.
So you're saying competing interest even
yeah, and then in the charter schools, the same thing. I mean, essentially the vocational schools are charter school now. I mean, that's essentially what it is. And I can't blame them for that. I mean, they're doing wonderful things there and helping kids out.
That raises an interesting point. Whatever reform the state settles on, should it be tied to the charter formula and the vocational way schools are?
I don't know enough about that in relation to the vocational schools. I don't know if Neshoba Valley Vocational Tech is as successful as Greater New Bedford Vocational Tech. I don't know how the other schools do, but I can tell you that I look at it as, I got high school age children who just recently graduated, and I can tell you that there was a group of kids that in the 80s when I was in high school would have absolutely gone to New Bedford High School. Their families are supportive of their education, they value education, they're not the super students, they're not the poor students, they're not the difficult behavioral issues. Those kids are now not going to Bedford High School, and they're going to a vocational school. Why? Well, it makes a lot of financial sense too. They're going to go there, they're going to learn a trade. Well, they're in college, they can work as a plumber, electrician, or do whatever. And all of that happens. What happens now is the percentage of those kids has reduced at the high school. Now the percentage of high school kids are taking the kids who are academically troubled at vocational schools and putting them into an academic setting where they're never going to achieve what the vocational schools would have given them.
No, I think
so. That gap. That's why the gap is growing. The gap is growing because we don't have.
Right. We have the city right now saying that they're going to be in crisis if this charter school that wants 1,000 seats, maybe they get 500. The governor is a big supporter of charter schools. Whether you take the mayor's numbers or not, clearly there are issues related to the charter reimbursement formula and the vocational they get a lot more money than the comprehensive high school does. And so there are issues of inequity connected to that. Can you connect one or the other?
I'll comment as someone, I don't know who else at this table. I'm a strong supporter of charter schools, and it's vastly different than vocational schools. The big difference is charter schools enrollment is done out of a blind draw. I've attended them. Literally, they draw names out of a hat, whereas our vocational schools, you have to apply for, and they take the best and the brightest. They absolutely cream the best and the brightest, where the charter schools don't.
Yeah.
And
the charter schools the parent has to opt in.
The parent has to opt in. Let me finish. Maybe we go to an opt-out. So let's go to opt-out. I support that as a charter schools proponent, where every student has the ability and has their name in the hat for a blind draw. They draw their quota, and parent, do you want your child to go? I can't speak for New Bedford charter schools. I don't represent them. I know we have 2 in Fall River that are tremendously successful, that are non-controversial, that there's a good working relationship between the charter school administration and the city administration. And if you look at their demographics, they are identical in special needs, in English language learners, as low-income students. The numbers are almost identical. I do not buy, and I guess the principal difference I have with some local municipal school leaders is that when I hear the premise that you're taking money away from the local district school, it's not the local district school's money. It's the parents' money, it's the children's money, it's the students' money, and the money follows the student. Now, the funding formula for charter schools in Massachusetts, which is the most robust in the country by far, the problem is we in the legislature only funded it about 75%. Even at 75%, it's still the most robust. We still reimburse the community 100% in the first year for the student that's not going there. 75% the second year for a student that's not going there. 50% for the third year for a student that's not going there. It's only in the 4th and 5th year that the reimbursement level is lower than what we should be funding for. So the real raid, and I agree with Chris, this shocks me that there's more students at New Bedford vote than New Bedford High School.
Yeah. Well,
wow.
Not only that, but
wow.
because they have a...
I did not know that.
Because they are able to reject kids who have poor attendance, discipline problems of any sort, in poor grades, the kid that makes New Bedford High School a much more homogeneous...
Which the charter schools cannot do.
Right.
The charter schools cannot do that. So the charter schools are the target, and they should not be the target.
But let me just say something.
Let me jump in, because you started on this one.
Just 1 second. In that, in the end, and I've said it before, it's politically incorrect, but you need parents who value education. They don't have to be smart. They don't have to be the smartest person, but they have to value their kid's education. And I say this, I worked in the child abuse unit. Guy punches a kid in the stomach and ruptures his spleen. That's child abuse.
Right, but the child with an opioid addict also deserves good education who can't apply to the child school.
Amen.
But I agree with that. But there's a lot of other people who are indifferent. And then let me finish. Is that you destroy a kid's organ by doing that. Well, your brain's an organ too. And if you don't help your child develop that organ, your brain, his brain, one way or the other, or get people to help him develop that, that's neglect.
See, it only took a half hour before we got emotional.
But that's
if I could, I had not thought of, until Chris raised it, the idea that the VOC is a competitor. I'd consider it a healthy competitor of the regular part of the system. In my district, I've got 3 different VOC schools that thrive and do very well. But as to the charter, the only thing, and it's well described out there, that the senator describes about the money following the child, with all respect, it's really not an honest argument, because if you take, I'll just make up a percent, if you say, we're going to take 5% and let that money follow the student, it's not that the New Bedford School District can say, okay, well, 5% fewer faculty or 5% fewer classrooms or infrastructure or utility costs. The system that it takes to run challenging district like New Bedford, you take that 5%, it's everywhere. It's in every building, and you can't, because there are 2 fewer students this fall in a particular teacher's class. The city is still obligated to provide that service. So the money following is the money gone. You can say it belongs to the parents, but actually when we pay taxes, it's then part of the commonwealth, which is a word that I think you have to always keep in mind about Massachusetts. I don't pay in a tax bill what I think is fair for education, fair for this. We do trust the elected people. We give them our consent to make these decisions on our behalf. And with education, on this one, I agree with the mayor. I also expressed a letter, as Tony Cabral and Chris Hendricks did, that to have an impact all at once on New Bedford of just over 1,200 seats on the school department's budget, given the way we currently handle it, which is, I think, inadequate, in terms of the state making up the difference, I think is really too much of a burden to put on the Bedford school system. That 1,200, I think that's been requested, whatever the exact number, I think is too much.
So is there consensus in the legislature to link charter funding to whatever education reform you settled on?
No.
I don't think I've heard that discussion.
No.
I think that would be beyond the capability that we started today's discussion of what are we going to do on Chapter 7.
Let's remember that the focus on the funding formula reform was the big 4 items.
Right.
And we tackle those 4 items, then we can start looking at some of the other things that are affecting how we fund our schools, whether it's the voc school issue and the charter issue, but I think we need to keep a focus. Let's get these big 4 taken
And there's
care of.
consensus on the big 4? There is.
Well, if there was
four on that?
consensus, we
Consensus
would
on
have
the
had
topic,
a
not the
solution.
solutions.
Not on the
Well,
big
yeah, well,
Know that we have to address these, but the actual addressing it. Maybe.
But here's
Because the House bill did not address ELL last
No.
year.
yes, it did.
Well, yeah, I mean, it did by saying, let's study this and come up with a formula. I mean, I represent New Bedford. I'm not defending just the Senate bill, I'm just speaking pure numbers. The Senate bill meant millions of dollars more for New Bedford. That's the bill I want.
So where is the House on the EL?
Hundreds of millions, actually, over years.
I don't think there's a consensus view within the House, but as to whether there was a bill in front of the conference committee that said, in FY19 we're going to spend X million, FY20 this, FY20. No, that wasn't even in Section 5 of the Senate bill either. Just said, we will pick a number every year. Well, we know that. What I think is real ed reform is, again, what we did, Mark as well, 25 years ago, which is we said, here's the plan. In the next 5 fiscal years, here's what we're going to spend on Chapter 70. Do you like it? Do you not like it? Using this formula. And then everyone could run those numbers and say, what does that mean for New Bedford? What does that mean for Wellesley? What does that mean for Orleans, anywhere you want it? We didn't have that this summer. We're going to have it this year in order for there to be a bill.
Okay.
So the beauty of this beast, because we don't operate in the legislature as a commonwealth, we may call ourselves the commonwealth, but we, as I mentioned earlier, we all have our own district dynamics, we have our own experiences we bring to the legislature. It's all well and good, it's democracy. But that's one of the reasons I'm relatively optimistic we'll solve most, if not all of these. And be careful, I don't want to eat my words in 2 years, because I'll be very disappointed if we don't solve it. I know you will. But we can disagree. So I disagree with Mike, at least on some of the charter school aspects, for the reason that you brought up, Jack. My responsibility is to help prevent even segregation among the poorest of the poor. So if you're fortunate enough, I certainly didn't grow up in a family with a lot of money, but I was fortunate enough to have 2 parents at home who cared about education, and they very well may have, in fact did for part of my education, choose a private Catholic school, because they were responsible enough to say, that's where we want you, and we're going to go out of our way, and we're going to transport you every morning. Lots of kids today, that's not their reality, and the decision should not be made for them. So I like the opt-out. It gets me closer to support, but I would also suggest that more has to be done. You know, I've questioned the charter school, the guy who runs the charter school, and I mean, they claim they go in and they recruit, and all these things are wonderful, but at the end of the day, if you have to set up a separate system, you're admitting, in a sense, failure of the general system. So I don't think we should just throw money at it. I agree with some of the statements that have been made, that with it has to come the reform, it has to come, you know, an update from 93 isn't just the formula. But again, the beauty of it is, the votes are not there to fix the charter school controversy. The votes are not there to make suburbanites feel good. The votes are not there to simply fix a formula that benefits gateway cities. But if you cobble it all together in the same broad negotiations, I do think this term there's enough pressure to get it done, because the difference that we have, we meaning like-minded or like demographics, and that includes gateway cities, it includes populations where there is a high English language learner or low-income student population. It's not an exaggeration to say that it's more crisis than luxury. It's wonderful to get minimum aid and to say I can, you know, build, I think, was it Newton that built the $200 million school, Mike? I mean, come on,
Yeah,
come on. You know, they should have been embarrassed.
Well, that's why we changed it.
Yeah.
Right,
Well, yeah, of course, we changed it after the horse was
right
around the track.
But
So
there won't be
a long time ago.
I just close by saying, I
That's
think
the school building association.
I think it would be a mistake to try to fix these piecemeal, because then you peel off, and that's why I'm glad that the final bill last year wasn't just a bill that dealt with healthcare and special ed, because you might never get to the low-income and English language learner. And for those that really want to fix charter schools, you might never get whatever fix you're looking for. And one, of course, is the funding formula. If you believe, as Mike did, that it follows the student, but as Bill said, there are some fixed costs, then there's a great way to let the market at the end of the day have some influence, but not a drastic shock. Make sure that those fixed costs are, you know, amortized over a number of years. But if you underfund it and the funding gets even less during a budget crisis, then the charter schools are designed to be controversial.
One suggestion that's been made recently is that to fix the problem like of a city like Bedford with a big charter coming in, if the funding formula isn't fixed adequately, is just have them take over an individual school that is struggling, so that you solve the opt-out problem that Mark was talking about. So in other words, you don't have them getting all the engaged parents, all parents who really,
But isn't that what happened at the Parker School? They came down, the state came down to the turnaround program. The night of the whole school, all their parents were invited. If I remember correctly reading this is 8-10 years ago, 12 parents showed up.
This is the local charter school who has strong
Yeah.
relationships with parents now.
No, I know, but I mean, the idea was
the
that.
state running, not a charter.
Yeah,
So
but-
I don't think it's
but
quite the same.
The idea of having engaged parents is a huge factor. I mean, we can keep throwing money and money and money, but at the end of the day, you need to look at. Mark just talked about it. You look at you have to have people who value it. You don't have to be great at it, but you have to value it and know that this is going to make my kid's life better. Now, are there people who are unable to do that, incapable of doing that? Yes. And those are the people why we have special ed, why we have all these other programs within our schools to assist in that. It should be a crutch that people can rely upon, but it shouldn't be something that, because of a lack of effort, and simply that, oh, I don't feel like going to a parent-teacher conference, oh, I don't feel like doing that as a parent, that's absurd to me, absolutely absurd to me that parents would do that.
It's reality, though.
It is, but there's a difference between parents who are incapable of doing it, and then there are parents who are just disinterested.
But you're not going to write off those children.
No, you're not, but the idea of, we need to have like a serious discussion with the idea of the value of parenting in the education world.
So
We
will
need to-
will the legislature be talking about accountability measures and things other than dollars in these 4 areas as you go forward?
I'm sure.
Is that on the table, or is that sort of?
I expect amendments.
I would
When you
hope
get
so.
a floor debate, I would hope that you're going to see amendments in both chambers where people will force a discussion of some of those policy issues on accountability.
Whether it happens or not, that's
Yeah.
another question, but there'll certainly be discussions.
Ian is already pressuring the legislature for additional,
Yeah.
for any additional money requires additional accountability. I'm not agreeing, okay, because the accountability issue is why you have such different opinion at the vocational school now. The vocational schools had to pass the NCAS. When I was a kid, those kids at the vocational school were not going to be able to pass the MCAS. They were going to be great carpenters and electricians, but they were not going to be able to do the English and the math. And then...
No, mainly because they gave them shitty academics.
Absolutely.
Look at the curriculum back
So,
then.
but-
Surprising you could even get through
But when
anything.
you require a public school, vocational or otherwise, to pass the MCAS, you're going to increase the academics there that parents now say, this is not a bad alternative. Not cosmetology perhaps or hairdressing, but the kids coming out of the Voc are not going to Harvard and Princeton, but they're going to Stonehill and Northeastern and Wentworth. That's pretty darn good. But they have to pass the MCAS.
A couple of them are going to.
Yeah, they are, but they were homeschooled before they got to the Voc.
Yeah, but
still.
the idea, no, I agree with you. I think.
But it's not the wasteland of public education that it was when I was in the 60s and 70s. It can't be. You can't require MCAS and do
I know,
that.
but what's the alternative for kids who have no interest in academics and are behavioral issues? And a lot of the times they're not necessarily together either, but just say a kid who has no interest in academics.
Yep.
And wants to go into a trade.
You're absolutely right. You know what the
No,
problem
yeah.
is? The model's wrong.
Yeah.
We took the 1960s model and it's 2019, two separate
Yeah.
schools. Why are we running two separate schools?
Chris is on a really, I hear this, I grew up and lived in the building trade world. That's my life prior, other than that. And I'm hearing from all the trades, whether it's plumbing, electrician, sheet metal, you name it. The Voc school, the kids aren't going there to become auto body technicians or, I can hire as apprentice plumbers and make a good living. I always joke because my friend with the biggest boat, and the most vacation homes is a plumber,
I told you about Westport.
This is Somerset, but that's okay. Even in Somerset, that's okay. So Chris raises a really good point, but I think and getting back to Susan's point, is we got to focus on these four. When we talk about education, there's a lot we can talk about. We can talk about early childhood, the fact that Mississippi has universal pre-K. Are you kidding me? And we don't in Massachusetts. But let's focus on the big four. Then we can talk charters. Then we can talk vocational school realignment. Then we can talk about early childhood, where that's close to $1 billion also.
Susan, can you talk a little bit about something like Wareham, where they have felt that the funding formula was really unfair to them? You have large blue-collar pockets, I know Westport does.
Yep.
Indeed, and we have the Voc School, Upper Cape Tech, that is doing some serious harm to
Same thing as,
Wareham.
yeah,
Absolutely.
same thing.
In fact, I mean, it's a little off the education topic, but Upper Cape virtually recruited many, I don't want to say almost all of Wareham's really good football athletes to a point where, it's just one of those things. I mean,
Old Rochester will beat them
the
anyway.
athletes and
Stanwell.
Wareham is
Old Rochester's
very
taking
similar
the
to
Bedford.
New Bedford.
What did people in Wareham want in the funding formula? What did they want addressed?
Oh, everything needs, everything needs to be addressed. I mean, again, I think there's an understanding that we have to start at point A and get something done, and then, you know, again, look at the broader picture. But Wareham is in a lot of the same situations that New Bedford is in, again, on a somewhat smaller scale, with special education needs and English language learners. We have a lot of out-of-district kids coming in, homeless issues, where, you know, we're transporting those children, we're educating those children. It's, you know, we're a smaller town with the same big city issues.
Are there losers if we go forward with these 4 points? Are there some suburbs that are losers in a bad way?
Every year, anyone with colleagues or local school officials for the last 20 years, I have yet to see a community or a school district that has any other view but that if we just reform the formula, we'll get more money. 100% of the school districts think reform of the formula means, you know, what was unfair to them will be fixed and they will get more money. So it can't be. It's like that town where everybody is above average. So
I thought that was only on Mattapoisett.
That's in Minnesota. And so the political reality is that if you reform it so that everyone gets more money, it costs more money. And everyone has to, legislators, I mean, have to be prepared for that reality. When we, the current formula, and I used to have the numbers at my fingertips, 20 to 25 years ago, the population of the public school system in Boston was at a certain level. We have never penalized them. As we added to Chapter 70 over the years, we have held everybody harmless, even to the point where, not to pick on Boston, there is a huge drop in student population. I mean, in the order of 10, 20, 30%. Fewer students being taught, but the funding levels have never dropped, to even though the original formula was based on student population.
As a whole house.
Mark knows, he's seen this in the room. So everyone believes they will get more money out of reforming the formula, and they probably will in order to accomplish what Mark has talked about, which is where you're going to find the votes.
Yeah, so the answer is that there are no losers, or it wouldn't end up surviving. But there are people who win relatively less, and in most cases they're communities who shouldn't win anything. That's the whole point of ed reform, was to actually add some heft to the myth that everyone has equal access to a good education. So in a sense, by its nature, it was an affirmative action program. And we've gotten away from it with things like minimum school aid. I mean, why don't we just call it what it is? We are paying you off because we need your vote. I mean, give me a break. No one loses. And the folks who win should be legit, and that's why it shouldn't just be money. That's why it needs careful thought on what the formula should look like. That's why all of these things should be considered together. But this notion that someone loses, great example, I helped create the Seaport Bond. And there was you could fit on one hand the number of actual working commercial seaports that should have benefited. And I happened to be in a position where I had to listen to other members who wanted to change the language and earmark. And I mean, you would have had people claiming that Buttonwood Pond was a seaport. You know, I mean, it's just unbelievable. What about the common? Absolutely. What about the Commonwealth? You know, what about the achievement gap? And by the way, some of the folks who spend so much time talking about the outcome of the achievement gap, which is an income gap.
You're the guys to change this.
Well, yeah. I mean, but I can't force who gets elected in some wealthy suburb around Boston in La La Land. I'm sorry. I mean, it's like where you're building $200+ million schools and people are going to meetings saying my kids won't survive unless you put a cafe in the school. I mean.
But the question you asked, at the end of the day, will there be losers? I don't see if there is a material amount of losers you'll ever get the votes. I mean, I can tell you that when whenever a funding schedule is proposed, the first thing my staff does is run the numbers for all 7 of my communities.
Oh, we all do that.
You know, what does this mean for my urban? What does this mean for Fall River, which receives now 88% of their school funding via Chapter 70? What does it mean for Westport, which is at 32%?
Yeah.
You know, currently. So what does,
That's
you know,
the
so you
reality.
run the numbers, and then we have to make a decision
Find some money.
that either find some money or make a decision whether or not we think that funding formula is equitable enough
I could
amongst our,
I'm sorry.
amongst our breadth of, I have a diversity. I have Fall River, I have Rochester, you know, I mean, it goes from one, you name it. I have a community of Somerset that saw 51% of their tax base disappear over 5 years. Now, that money doesn't disappear, that just gets, that's shifted to the residential and existing commercial users, and they've seen over 100% increase over the last 2 years in their property taxes.
So I checked in those numbers just to see in my office. So Boston currently has a student population of about 56,000 students. They maintain a capacity in terms of classroom staffing for 90,000 students. And we have never...
Can you all put that on the table?
Well,
To what end?
So one quick question for the group is, some of you know, I was school committee member for 12 years, starting in the early 90s. So I went through the formula, right, inherited the formula. And the formula was flawed from day one. But it got its votes to get passed. The Cape, Barnstable County, got screwed because of the real estate side of it. And they always came in. And when they came in is where the pothole money came from, right? So it was, we're not going to change the formula because we don't have the votes, but we're going to get this other pot of money that will make you a little happy. So money is what, you're absolutely right. But in 1992-93, the formula wasn't, we didn't have the charter schools. So the money wasn't being stripped off to go to other places, right or wrong. And I'm not saying, I'm just saying the use of it. We didn't have that. We didn't have the healthcare costs. We didn't have the pension costs at the same levels where they are now, that are not going to classrooms. That money is Chapter 7 money that's not going to classrooms. I give you accolades if you can get the formula changed. However, I'm not sure it's the formula that I would be looking at. It's more money. It's paying 100% for regional transportation. It's paying 100% for the reimbursement. I mean, those things are short-sighted. But if you're going to use $1 billion someplace, fill in the 100% formulas. I don't know if you'd get all the votes for that, but who wouldn't? Regional transportation affects almost every district has something to do with regional transportation. If you got a vocational school, you do. And I think it's somewhere around 60% reimbursement now. It started up and then keeps getting cut down and down. Transportation costs are incredible. Yeah, but it fluctuates. And you can't even budget for it because it fluctuates. I mean, I was the treasurer for the region, so I don't know what the schools wanted more money, right? What the school committees wanted more money. I don't think they really care about the formula as long as they're getting more money. I don't know where you go to get the votes to change that thing. Because you work with that Western Massachusetts group, that's a whole different set of school formulas where that goes, and the Cape is so much different than Wareham, right next door. It's so different. I don't know where it all goes. More money, and we know on this end of the table, the lawsuit's coming. Right? The lawsuit is what brought in Ed Reform, Rennie and Rebella, all those guys. I was part of the lawsuit, so the next lawsuit's coming, and it's not any individual's fault at the legislative level. It's just times have changed.
No, but I'm fine with the lawsuit. It's just like when people put something on the ballot. When the legislature doesn't do their job, people put it on the ballot. And then people complain in the legislature that it's a mess from the ballot. Do your job, it doesn't go on the ballot. Do your job, it doesn't go to court. Very simple.
But you don't want the court deciding who gets what more money.
No, if I have a choice between a court case that forces the hand or the status quo, I'll take the form.
Right. The court case did not. I was on the other end in '93. I was actually on the finance committee, so I had to work with my school department to all the indirect cost sharing and everything. The formula, in order to address the court case, is very, very complicated. In an anecdotal story, we had a member of the Westport Finance Committee about 10 years ago who really wanted to delve into it. He had problems with the formula, so he delved into it. And the funny thing is, he was a rocket scientist. He was a retired Apollo, John Miller. I mean, he was, so he's not a rocket scientist. No, he is a rocket scientist. The guy's great. And he spent about a month on it, including coming up to the State House to talk to like the 3 people that really understand the intricacies of this 30 matrix funding formula. And at the end of the day, he says, you know what? Hats off to them. It's so difficult trying to quantify, which is such a qualified issue of your ability to pay and the wealth of a community. What is your ability? That, you know, they did about as good a job in the formula. So to your point, Peter, you're correct. It's, you know, we don't fund charter school reimbursement at 100%. We don't fund regional school transportation at 100%. And also, I think some of the responsibility has to go back on the local municipalities. In 2010, we had no money, right? But communities were Municipal Relief Act, or whatever the hell it was called. You know, how many communities opted into the state GIC? If health insurance is your driver, where we are all belong to the GIC, where we're seeing 1 or 2% premium increases, where local municipalities are seeing 12 to 14%, well, why aren't they in the GIC?
Because the municipal unions.
No, they don't have to. We passed it that they do not need, it's out of collective bargaining. It's not a local municipality.
No, the municipal unions lobby the city council.
The city council, right, but the city council can do it, so why haven't they done it?
Because the municipal unions.
Because it's easy to say,
They want enough money, they want us to make the hard decisions.
It's the same pressure on them as you.
Right, but we made the hard decision. We faced the municipal unions when we said it's outside of collective bargaining because it's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
And don't tell me it's not good quality insurance. Every judge, every state police trooper, every college professor, they are all on. We have very good health insurance that we have to pay for. And no, it's not zero copay or $5.95 5 paid. But so it isn't. It's more reasonable, but it's damn good. The private sector would love to have our health insurance options as state employees. So I think some of it falls back on the local municipality. I don't know. New Bedford adopt GIC? I don't know. No, I don't know. Because like I said, I don't represent.
It's much easier to say the state doesn't give us enough money. Look at the trends and what we give in Chapter 70 and local aid. You know, even the charter school situation. I mean, I'm not in any way diminishing the impact, but it's less than 10% of what this.
I got all the millionaires over there.
Even additional $7 million last year. I mean, it's like the state didn't give us enough. Come on. Take a hard decision. We have to do it all the time.
So we do need to wrap up, and I just want to thank you all for coming. This has been
Thanks for having
really,
us.
really
Thank you for having
helpful.
us.
Does anybody need to make, do you all feel like you guys can say what you want to say?
I feel like I'm obligated to say one
I think
more
Chris
thing.
said everything.
As a good attorney, he wants to get the last word.
Everyone has mentioned what they were doing in 1993. I was still in school.
Well, you could thank us for your good education.
My parents.
What times did you go through?
What's that? What's that?
Nothing.
Thank you.